It's Thursday, the 4th of May. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel, fresh back from another trip from Sydney, Australia in the Boeing 777. And while I was over there, the ATSB, the Australian Transportation Safety Board, released an exquisitely detailed preliminary report on the loss of the Coulson 737 Airtanker back on February earlier this year. The reason that the report has these exquisite details is because they've got the data from on board the aircraft. Let's check it out. With all the data available to them from this early model 300 series 737, the ATSB was able to put together this animation, which we're going to go over in detail, which appears to show that the crew of this aircraft simply allowed this aircraft to get in the undesirable state of being too low and too slow for this airplane for this drop, impacting the terrain right there. Onto the report released on the 3rd of May by the ATSB. On 6 February 2023, at about 15:32 local time, a Coulson Aviation Boeing 737-300 series large air tanker. This air tanker has a 4,000-gallon constant flow tank on it. Call sign Bomber 139, registered November 619 Sierra Whiskey, departed from Brusselton Airport, Western Australia, on a firefighting task to the Fitzgerald River National Park, Western Australia. There were two pilots on board. The aircraft captain in the left seat was the pilot flying, and the co-pilot in the right seat was the pilot monitoring. The distance between these two locations is 260 miles, about 417 kilometers. It takes this crew nearly an hour and a half to do a load and return over these vast distances in Australia. Earlier in the day at 10:15, then again at 12:15 and 13:10, the Western Australia Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, the DBCA, submitted aerial fire suppression requests to the State Operations Air Desk. The request was for fixed-wing assets to the location of the fire 24 kilometers west-northwest of Hopetoun, if I'm saying that correctly, Western Australia, under the criteria of known high fuel loads and likelihood of excessive rate of spread and or extreme fire danger. In response, they identified the aerial assets available, they got the common frequency, they spoke to the pilots, and they sent the tasking messages. Bomber 139 was included in the 1127, 1407, and 1505 taskings. The SAR-Watch recorded the Bomber 139 departed Brusselton on these taskings at 12:08 and 13:30. So that's almost an hour and a half load and return time. So the crew had made at least two runs on this fire earlier in the day. At 15:19, the bird dog's responsibility for the lats, let's back up a second. The bird dog, that's the job I was flying or training for here in the States, more commonly called a lead plane. This is the aircraft, well, the bird dog you'll see there's several bird dogs on this fire. There's a low-level qualified bird dog pilot or lead plane pilot that's going to lead the tanker in on the drop, and then there's another bird dog that's orbiting above the fire, conducting the entire air show over the fire. LATs, large air tankers. At 15:19, the bird dog responsibility for the LATs at the Fireground transferred from bird dog 125 to 123 due to refuel requirements, and that's pretty common. One low-level bird dog will be working the fire and the tankers, and then he's going to bingo out of there for fuel, and he's going to transfer control to another bird dog that's been sitting standby at the base. They'll do a briefing from the air as to what's going on, and then they'll take over the fire. With bird dog 682 stationed above as the primary air attack aircraft. So that's the second bird dog orbiting overhead, keeping the big picture view on the fire. Before Bird Dog's 125's departure, a familiarization flight of the fire zone was conducted by Bird Dog 123 to discuss the layout of the fire, tactics, retardant drops, and objectives for the drops. That's your standard briefing procedure. No hazards were discussed, probably because there was virtually no hazards in the area. This is relatively level, rolling terrain of primarily low-lying scrub type brush. The crew of Bomber 139 contacted Bird Dog 123 when they were 15 minutes from the Fireground. The crew of Bird Dog 123 acknowledged and advised an altimeter setting. This is a real important part of the whole task. An altimeter setting, QNH, of 1003 hectopascals, so that everybody's on the same sheet of music and has the same altimeter setting for altitude separation. Bomber 139's crew acknowledged the altimeter setting and informed Bird Dog 123 that they would contact Bird Dog 682 when they were 5 minutes from the Fireground. The pilot of Bird Dog 682, the one high overhead, subsequently cleared Bomber 139 to enter the fire control traffic area not above an altitude of 2,500 feet, so they remain separated. And Bomber 139's crew notified them that they would be working with Bird Dog 123, that's the low-level lead plane Bird Dog, on an altimeter setting of 1003. Again, so everybody's on the same sheet of music. The crew of Bird Dog 123 queried Bird Dog 682 if the drop zone was clear and were advised that no ground personnel had been sighted and they were not expected for about another hour. Which brings up the whole question to me of how effective is this whole aerial attack out there? The whole idea of aerial firefighting, just like any form of aerial combat, is to support the ground troops. Where are the ground troops? This is a very far out location, and the ground troops are en route. We'll see some pictures that they did get some dozers in there, and they were very effective. But because of the vast distance of Australia, it makes these firefighting efforts very challenging, especially for the effective use of air tankers. At this stage, Bomber 139's co-pilot advised the captain of their drop airspeeds, which included a target drop airspeed, V-drop, of 133 knots, which is 1.25 times the stall speed of the aircraft in the given configuration. Remember, this is a 737 operating with a 4,000-gallon tank. That retardant weighs upwards of 9 pounds per gallon, so that's some 36,000 pounds of retardant, but there's only 2 crew members on board, and that makes the 737 still well under its maximum gross weight, plenty of excess performance. When the crew of Bomber 139 reported Bird Dog 123 in sight, they were asked if they wanted a show-me run or to follow Bird Dog 123 straight to the drop. So when you're doing these lead plane operations, you can give the pilots a couple of different options. One is they can orbit high overhead and you demonstrate to them the low-level lead run, downwind base and final, and talk to them and show them exactly where you want to drop the retardant. You can then hook up with the air tanker and then lead him in on the drop. Or you can just have the air tanker fall in right behind you, about a quarter mile or so behind you, and follow you in for the drop. Bomber 139's crew responded that they would follow them and go straight to the drop. The crew of Bird Dog 123 then obtained confirmation that right-hand circuits would be acceptable due to the visibility. So I'm assuming they're working on the left flank of the fire, doing right-hand orbits to stay out of the smoke. Stand by, let me get the chalkboard out. Though it's not well illustrated in this preliminary report, I believe this is the primary fire area, which has subsequently gotten dozer lines drawn around it. And this is the right-hand patterns that the Bird Dog and Air Tanker are flying. So remember your nomenclature over fire. This is the heel of the fire, the origin of the fire. It spreads this way. This map is oriented north up. The winds were out of the south. So this is the heel of the fire, this is the head of the fire where the fire is currently burning, and this is the left flank as observed from the heel. This is the right flank, again as observed from the heel. And so the air tankers are over here doing right-hand orbits, attacking the left flank, staying clear of the smoke as it's blowing over this way. And this burn area here appears to be the post-crash fire after the tanker crashed. So this accident sequence consists of a split load, or 2 drops. Bomber 139 was briefed by the bird dog that the plan was to tag and extend the existing line of retardant while keeping the smoke off to the left side, pilot's left. Bomber 139's crew subsequently reported to bird dog 123 that they were in position, and the captain called for the pre-drop checklist from the co-pilot. The crew of Bomber 139 notified bird dog 123 that their target speed would be 135 knots for final, and then set their flaps to full flaps, or flaps 40, which is full flaps in the 737. So he's got to tell that bird dog that speed, because that's the speed he wants the bird dog to fly so that they can stay in formation and on speed for the drop. At least that's the speed they want on final, and that speed has been calculated based on their gross weight of their aircraft. He's got a full tank of retardant now, 36,000 pounds of retardant. Bomber 139's crew was then briefed on the drop by bird dog 123, which included a straight exit, no hazards, a downslope, and a target altitude initially of 500 feet descending to 400 feet. Remember, these are QNH altimeter settings, or height above sea level. And so he's given them barometric altitude settings that'll keep them clear of the terrain. But again, it's primarily the captain's responsibility to remain at least 150 feet above the vegetation using his eyeballs. The co-pilot subsequently reported to the captain that the checklist was complete, and bird dog 123 reported turning on to final for the drop, which was on a heading of 155 degrees. Once on final, bird dog 123's crew advised Bomber 139 to start at the road and keep all smoke to the left. 3, 2, 1, start. Your target altitude is 500 feet, descending to 400 feet. So that's the script that the tanker pilot gets from the bird dog as he flies directly over the point that he wants him to drop at. Bomber 139 descended to about 400 feet and completed a partial drop of 3/4 of their tank at about 70% N1 on the power setting. This will be important on this next drop. So it's a good stabilized approach with the power up, which you need on these jet aircraft. Before the captain stopped the drop because their retardant line was starting to enter an area that was already burned. So he wanted to save that last bit of retardant and get realigned for another drop, rather than trying to make it bend around and keep the retardant flowing. The partial drop was reported to bird dog 123, and another circuit commenced to tag and extend that line with the remaining retardant, with the captain remarking to the bird dog and head down off the hill. Let's go take a look at that. From the GPS data, they have the first drop coming in about 155 degrees from this angle, and then on the second drop, he bent it around a little further to the pilot's right to keep the retardant out of the black, or out of the already burned portion of the fire. So here's the hill that he's talking about. Here's the retardant drop from the accident flight. There's the impact point right there. So this first drop came in from this angle here and paralleled the fire. And this is an effective use of retardant here, that we see that the dozers did get to the fire in time to build a dozer line just inside of the retardant line. And this is the whole idea with supporting ground troops. You want the dozers there working the fire at the same time as the air tankers, and the dozers are making a clear line stopping the fire, while the retardant is simply slowing down the fire enough for the dozers to get in there and build this line. So on the second drop, he's going to want to come around here and run the retardant out this way. So he's got to clear this little hill here. He gets his retardant flowing, gets it extended to about here, and then on the exit, he's got this little knoll to clear, which he doesn't clear, impacting right there. The captain instructed the co-pilot to conduct the pre-drop checklist for the second drop. The co-pilot reported that 118 knots would be their drop speed, and the captain requested Bird Dog 123 to slow to 120 knots for the next drop, which they acknowledged. Pro tip, there's no need to ever go below 120 knots when dropping aerial retardant. If you are at your correct drop height of 150 feet above the vegetation, at 120 knots, the retardant will effectively stop its forward momentum and just rain down perfectly on the foliage at 120 knots and 150 feet above the foliage. But again, remember, they're lightweight now. They've dropped 70% of their load, so they're down to the last 1,000 gallons or 9,000 pounds of retardant. Bird Dog 123's crew briefed Bomber 139 to tag and extend all existing retardant. It is start at the hill as it pushes down, target altitude 500, descending to 400. The co-pilot reported that flaps 40 was set and the pre-drop checklist was completed. The crew of Bird Dog 123 then provided the following commentary. Again, he's leading him in on the drop, and as he's flying, he's talking him through it. This is final. Fully retardant, drop out here in a second, stand by. He's waiting till he gets right over the point where he wants him to start dropping. Retardant's right at our 12 o'clock. He's talking about the retardant line here from the previous drop. 3, 2, 1, tag and extend existing retardant. So he wants him to tag into here and extend it on out this way. During the second drop, Bomber 139 descended through 400 feet altitude, 80 feet radio height. More on that in a minute. At about 110 knots computed airspeed and only 30% N1. This is at the engine's high idle speed. As the retardant line was extended downslope, the captain started to advance the throttle levers about 2 seconds before the aircraft's rate of descent peaked at about 1,800 feet per minute and started to pitch nose up. Very unstable part of the approach. There should never be any descent rates exceeding 1,000 feet per minute while on final, especially in this relatively level terrain. And we'll see in the animation there's just a slight bunt by the pilot which gets this 1,800 feet per minute going. The nose up pitch preceded the acceleration of the engine. So he pulled up first. It's the lag time of the jet engines. That's what you're dealing with here. These are not propeller driven tankers. You got to operate these things like the airliners that they are. And we went through this same problem in the airline industry when we transitioned from propeller driven aircraft like the DC-3s and 4s and 6s to airliners. We found out the hard way that at flaps 40 and throttles idle, you can get a hell of a sink rate going in these aircraft, and it takes a lot more lag time than we were ever used to when we were flying propeller driven aircraft. The nose up pitch came up first before the engines accelerated. So even though he's pushing the throttles up, it's taking that lag time of the engines, resulting in a reversal in the rate of descent. He stopped the rate of descent, but also a decay in the airspeed. The captain then announced, "Fly the airplane," followed immediately at about 16:14. That's a difference in time between the two clocks we're talking about here, by the activation of the stick shaker and an abrupt vertical acceleration associated with the aircraft impacting a ridgeline at an elevation of about 222 feet at 104 knots computed airspeed, with the engines now at 85 to 89% N1. The co-pilot did not announce any deviations during the drop and accident sequence, and later reported their focus of attention was likely on the airspeed indicator and the radio altimeter. And to be fair, this sequence of events occurred very, very quickly. Within a matter of seconds, the captain got this aircraft in a very undesirable state. After the impact with the ridgeline, the aircraft cleared a small line of foliage before impacting the ground a second time and then sliding to a rest. In response to the collision, Bird Dog 123's crew made an all-stations Mayday call. After the motion ceased, the co-pilot started the evacuation checklist. Both pilots were unable to open the cabin door. That's the cabin door behind the two pilots, in between them, as it was buckled, and the co-pilot was unable to open the right side window. The captain observed out the left side window that a post-impact fire had started and managed to open that window on their second attempt. Both pilots then exited out the left window and moved clear of the wreckage and the fire. They were subsequently rescued by a helicopter involved in the fire control activities after 2 single-engine air tankers dropped retardant on the aircraft fire, believing that the crew were still inside. And this has happened before in aerial firefighting, where a plane has crashed and subsequent tankers drop on that airplane to stop that post-crash fire. The crew suffered minor injuries and the aircraft was destroyed. The aircraft was a 1995 model 737-3H4, about 69,000 hours on the airframe, and was outfitted by Coulson for aerial firefighting with the CFM 56-3 turbofan engines, the stock engines. Meteorological information: on the day of the accident, there was a low pressure trough crossing southern Western Australia, resulting in thunderstorms and wind direction changes from the northeast and southeast to the southwest. The geographical area forecast for the accident site included moderate turbulence from surface to 10,000 feet with thermals, and a SIGMENT was issued for frequent thunderstorms. While the northwestern boundary of the SIGMENT was close to the accident site, satellite and radar imagery indicated that there were no thunderstorms in the vicinity of the accident site at the time of occurrence. So one of the things that can easily do this to you is a big sinker, a big downdraft, or a wind shear, but preliminary indications from this report do not indicate to me that there was any sign of a wind shear impacting this aircraft. Winds were out of the east-southeast at 14, gusting to 20 knots. Now that can produce quite a bit of turbulence at that low of an altitude. Here they talk about this photo here where this damage is caused by the jet blast from the engines. There's the initial point of impact, second impact, and final stop there. And the displacement of the aircraft wreckage. There's a good drawing here of the knoll that they impacted on their escape after the drop. Now let's go take a closer look at the data. Here's the data from the last 5 minutes of the flight showing both drops, and then we'll show a graph of the last few seconds of the flight. So here is drop number 1, and here is drop number 2. The computed airspeed for drop number 1 is right around 125 knots or so. Flaps 40 for both drops. The power setting for drop number 1 is right up there around 65-70% N1, and the throttles are set right about at the same position. Vertical speed for drop number 1 stays between 0 and 500 feet per minute rate of descent. Now the altitude, he's showing a trend here of continuing to descend after the drop. So the corrected altitude starts the drop at about 500 feet, finishes the drop about 400 feet, but continues to descend a bit after the drop. You really shouldn't be doing that. You should be climbing out right away. And there's a big discrepancy here between the radar altimeter height and the corrected altitude height. So this aircraft is equipped with a radio altimeter, but is it correctly calibrated? Is it so far off that it's just a nuisance for the aircrew at this time? How much was the aircrew really relying or using the radio or radar altimeter? In these drops, it's a VFR. You're doing it with you're looking outside all the time. One of the things air tanker pilots often do to calibrate their eyeballs for 150 feet above the ground is, on training flights, you'll see them do a low pass down the runway at about 150 feet. What they're doing is they know the altitude of the runway, they got the altimeter setting, and they'll pick it up 150 feet and fly down the runway at 150 feet to calibrate their eyeballs for that altitude. Another known problem in terrain like this that's rolling and has relatively low brush, no tall timber, you tend to fly lower in terrain that has smaller brush features than you would in tall timber. The downhill sucking monster, we used to call that. Now on drop number 2, let's go look at the more detailed page. 20, 30, 30, 40, 40. Here's the last 30 seconds of the flight. Here is retardant drop 2 right in this bracket here. Computed airspeed decays well below 120 knots, which really should be your minimum airspeed for these drops, down to 108 knots or so for the drop, and even less once he begins the attempt to escape. Ground speed doesn't show a big or sudden change in ground speed. The vane angle of attack on the vane on the side of the aircraft versus the deck angle or pitch angle of the aircraft, we can see a big pitch up motion right here towards the end of the second drop. But the throttle position for the throttles is brought all the way back to idle until halfway through the second retardant drop. And as a result, the engines are brought right down to a high idle speed of about 30% N1 and remain so. There's that lag time difference between the time you begin pushing the throttles up and the time you begin getting the thrust that you're demanding from these older jet aircraft. And now the vertical speed on this graph, here's 0. This is all negative, or rate of descent. So you got a rate of descent exceeding 500 feet per minute. And then there's this bunt, this quick and sudden bunt that kind of corresponds to this, well, lags this drop in ground speed here all the way down to 1,800 feet per minute. But you can see that on the animation, there is a slight push on behalf of the pilot that gets this thing going to 1,800 feet per minute, which results in an altitude that he wants to continually drop through the terrain. It is slightly dropping terrain, but he continues to drop well after the drop until he impacts the terrain. And again, there's that big difference between the radio height and the corrected altitude. So with all that, let's go back and look at this animation provided by the ATSB, which is provided from the flight data recorder. At the beginning of the run, he's already below 120 knots, 500 feet altitude, MSL, 500 feet per minute rate of descent. Throttle's coming back to idle here, and that shadow of this stick is where you can see the neutral position, and the engines are coming back. Let's put this into motion. Throttle's coming back to idle right there. Rate of descent up to 1,000 feet per minute. Airspeed decaying. Throttle's coming up. That vertical speed hit 1,800 feet per minute right back in here with that little bunt of the nose down. Just a slight bunt is all it took. Bumped it up to 1,800 feet per minute. And impact. And just a slight rise in the terrain is all it took to take out this air tanker. So thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this kind of content possible, as it's as frequently demonetized by the folks that run YouTube. Thank you so much for your support. As we get more information, we'll continue to pass it on. See you here.